What happens when an 8-foot killing machine falls in love with the one human she's ordered to eliminate? When choosing your heart means betraying your entire species. This is the story of a weapon who learned to feel and the price of becoming human. They bred me to be perfect. 8 feet of engineered muscle and bone-scaled skin that could deflect plasma rounds reflexes faster than most species could even perceive. I wasn't supposed to feel. I wasn't supposed to question orders. And I definitely wasn't supposed to fall in love with a human. But here I am standing before the high tribunal of the Draconis Republic, shackled in energy restraints that burn against my wrists. The charge is treason against my own species, abandonment of military duty, and the one that makes their voices drip with disgust. Emotional contamination through interspecies bonding. The chief arbiter's voice echoes through the crystalline chamber. Commander Kaelra Vexithari, you stand accused of betraying your genetic purpose. You were created to be the apex predator, the ultimate weapon in our expansion across the galaxy. Instead, you chose to protect a single human male over the strategic interests of your people. I don't deny it. How could I? The evidence is right there on the screens surrounding us. Security footage of me holding his hand. Audio recordings of me laughing at his terrible jokes. Thermal scans showing my heart rate spiking every time he entered a room. All the proof they need that their perfect killing machine had become human. Tell us, Commander, the Arbiter continues, his golden eyes narrowing, what could possibly justify such a betrayal? I close my eyes and let my mind drift back to 6 months ago when everything changed, when my entire world shifted because of one moment, one touch, one man who saw me as something more than a weapon. It started on the ISC Meridian, a joint species research vessel patrolling the Outer Rim. I was there as military liaison, which really meant I was there to intimidate anyone who might cause problems. Most species knew better than to mess with a Draconis warbreed. At 8 feet tall, with claws that could tear through titanium and a bite force that could crush a shuttle's hull, I was walking nightmare fuel for most of the galaxy. The ship had taken heavy damage from a meteor shower while investigating some ancient ruins. Half the primary systems were offline, life support was failing, and our repair teams were overwhelmed. That's when they called for emergency assistance from the nearest human outpost. I remember watching through the viewport as their tiny shuttle approached. Humans. Such fragile little creatures. Average height barely over 5 feet. No natural armor. No claws, no enhanced senses. By every measure that mattered, they were among the weakest species in the known galaxy. Most of us wondered how they'd even made it off their homeworld. The shuttle docked with a soft hiss, and 3 humans stepped aboard. The first 2 were standard technicians, nervous and wide-eyed as they caught sight of me. They gave me the usual terrified nods and hurried past, their fear scent sharp in the recycled air. But the third one was different. Eli Vorn stepped onto our ship like he owned the place. Sandy brown hair, green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and an easy confidence that I'd never seen in a human before. He was carrying a toolkit that looked older than some planets I'd conquered, and when his gaze met mine, he didn't flinch. Didn't look away. He just smiled. Actually smiled. At me. At 8 feet of bioengineered death machine. You must be Commander Vexithari, he said, extending his hand toward me. I'm Eli. Mind if I take a look at your ship? She's in pretty rough shape. I stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment. In all my years of military service, no one had ever offered to shake hands with me. Most species bowed or saluted or simply tried to stay out of my way. But this human, this impossibly fragile creature, was treating me like an equal. The damage assessment is complete, I replied, my voice coming out more growl than words. Your assistance will be evaluated by our engineering staff. Eli nodded, but his hand stayed extended. Fair enough, but I've got to ask, have you tried recalibrating the plasma flow regulators? Sometimes after meteor impacts, they get knocked out of alignment. Creates all sorts of cascading failures. Something in his tone made me pause. He wasn't trying to impress me or prove his worth. He was just offering help, like it was the most natural thing in the world. You would need access to the primary engineering systems, I said slowly. Those sections are restricted to authorized personnel only. Well, he said finally, lowering his hand, I guess you'll have to decide if you trust me or not. Your ship, your call, Commander. Trust. What a concept. In my world, trust was earned through displays of strength, through victory in combat, through fear and respect. But here was this human asking for trust based on nothing more than his word and his willingness to help. And somehow, impossibly, I found myself saying, follow me. As we walked through the damaged corridors toward the engineering section, I couldn't help but study him. He moved with purpose, his eyes constantly scanning the damage, making mental notes. When we passed a section where the hull plating had buckled, he stopped and ran his fingers along the twisted metal. Beautiful work, he murmured. Beautiful, I had to ask. It's structural damage. He looked up at me with those green eyes and smiled again. Sure, but look at how the metal bent instead of breaking. The way the stress patterns flow through the hull. Your ship designers knew what they were doing. She's wounded, but she's not broken. Just needs someone to care enough to put her back together. I didn't realize it then, but he wasn't just talking about the ship. When we reached the engineering bay, I watched him work. And that's when everything I thought I knew about humans began to crumble. This wasn't some primitive creature fumbling with technology beyond his understanding. Eli moved through our advanced systems like he'd been born to it, his hands dancing over controls that most species needed years of training to master. But it wasn't just his skill that caught my attention. It was the way he worked, careful, gentle, like he was healing something precious instead of just fixing broken machinery. There we go, he said after about an hour, straightening up from the main console. Try your environmental systems now. I activated the controls and immediately felt the change. The air circulation improved, the artificial gravity stabilized, and the constant vibration that had been rattling the ship finally stopped. How did you, I started to ask. Sometimes the most complex problems have simple solutions, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. You just have to listen to what the machine is trying to tell you. He started packing up his tools, but then paused and looked at me. Really looked at me. Not at my claws or my height or the scars from a dozen battles. He looked at my eyes. You know, he said quietly, you have beautiful eyes. I know that probably sounds weird coming from a human, but they're like liquid amber. I've never seen anything like them. No one had ever called any part of me beautiful before. Terrifying, yes. Impressive, certainly. Deadly, absolutely. But beautiful. The word hit me like a physical blow, and I felt something strange happening in my chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with my internal body temperature. I should return to my duties, I managed to say. Of course, he replied, shouldering his toolkit. But Commander, if you ever need anything else fixed, just let me know. I'm good with broken things. He walked away, then leaving me standing in the engineering bay with my world tilted on its axis. Because somehow this small, fragile human had managed to do something that no weapon, no enemy, no force in the galaxy had ever accomplished. He had made me feel seen. And as I stand here now facing the consequences of that moment, I realize that everything that followed, every choice I made, every line I crossed, it all started with that simple act of kindness, with a human who looked at a weapon and saw a person instead. The Arbiter's voice cuts through my memories. Commander Vexthari, you will answer the charges against you. I opened my eyes and looked directly at him. I am guilty of every charge you've brought against me, and I would do it all again. Because sometimes the most perfect weapons are the ones that choose to stop fighting. You have to understand what I was before Eli came into my life. I wasn't just another soldier. I was Commander Kelra Vexthari, the Draconis Republic's most successful weapon of war. They called me the scale breaker across 4 star systems. Entire rebel fleets would surrender rather than face me in battle. I'd been genetically perfected from birth. Enhanced bone density, reinforced muscle fibers, accelerated healing, and a nervous system that could process information faster than most supercomputers. My creators had stripped away everything they considered weakness, empathy, fear, doubt, compassion, all the messy emotions that might interfere with pure efficiency, and it worked. By the age of 25, I'd never lost a battle. I'd conquered 17 worlds, crushed 43 separate resistance movements, and eliminated over 6,000 enemy combatants with my bare hands. the galaxy's most feared predator, and I wore that reputation like armor. But there was a cost to perfection. No one dared to get close to me, not just because of my size or my claws, but because of what I represented. I was death incarnate, and even my own people were terrified of me. Officers would communicate through intermediaries rather than speak to me directly. Crew members would change course to avoid walking down the same corridor. Even other war breeds kept their distance. I ate alone. I slept alone. I lived in a bubble of isolation, so complete that sometimes days would pass without anyone speaking directly to me, unless it was absolutely necessary. The loneliness was like a constant ache, but I told myself it didn't matter. Weapons don't need friends, they just need targets. Then came the assignment to the ISC Meridian, multi-species cooperation they called it. A chance to show the galaxy that different races could work together for the greater good. What a joke. I was there to make sure the other species remembered who held the real power. A living reminder that the Draconis Republic could end any of them if they stepped out of line. The ship was a marvel of compromise engineering. Human efficiency mixed with Centauri artistic flair, Corvan defensive systems integrated with Alterian navigation tech. It should have been a disaster, but somehow it all worked together, like a symphony where every instrument was different, but they created something beautiful when combined. Not that I paid much attention to beauty back then. I was too busy being perfect. Eli, on the other hand, was the complete opposite of perfect, at least by military standards. Human engineers ranked near the bottom of the interspecies technical hierarchy. They lacked the mathematical precision of the Centauri, the intuitive understanding of the Corvan, or the sheer processing power of the Alterian synthetics. But there was something about Eli that the rankings missed. He'd grown up on a colony world where they had to make do with whatever they could scrounge or build from scratch. No fancy equipment, no unlimited resources, just pure human ingenuity and stubborn refusal to accept that something couldn't be fixed. I learned all this later, of course. At the time, I just saw another inferior species member trying to prove himself worthy of serving alongside his betters. The fact that he'd had the audacity to offer me help without permission was unusual. Most humans were so intimidated by Draconis warbreeds that they could barely form coherent sentences in our presence. The days following his repair work fell into a strange routine. I would patrol the ship, maintaining security and checking systems, and somehow I kept finding myself near wherever Eli was working. Not intentionally, I told myself. Just coincidence. He was always busy. The Meridian was an old ship, and jury-rigged systems required constant maintenance. I'd watch him crawl through access tunnels barely wide enough for his human frame, or see him hanging upside down from a maintenance shaft completely absorbed in his work. What struck me was how much he seemed to enjoy it. While other crew members treated their duties as obligations to be endured, Eli approached every broken component like it was a puzzle to be solved. I'd catch him humming while he worked or talking to the machinery like it could hear him. "Come on, sweetheart," I heard him say to a particularly stubborn power coupling one day. "I know you want to work properly. Let's figure out what's making you cranky." It was endearing. Though I would have died before admitting that at the time, the armor incident happened 3 weeks after his arrival. I'd taken damage during a training exercise, nothing serious by my standards, but the biomechanical systems that regulated my combat suit had been knocked offline. Without proper calibration, the armor was more hindrance than help, throwing off my balance and restricting my movement. Standard protocol was to report to the ship's technician and wait for an appointment, but the ship's chief tech was a Centauri named Veltar, who treated me like I was some kind of walking war crime. He'd fix the armor, but he'd take his sweet time about it, making sure I knew exactly how inconvenient I was. I was sitting in the armory trying to manually adjust the servo motors when Eli appeared in the doorway. He took one look at me, struggling with the recalibration, and his face immediately shifted into what I was learning to recognize as his problem-solving expression. "Servo alignment issue," he asked, stepping into the room without invitation. "It's been handled," I replied, though clearly it hadn't been. He moved closer, his eyes studying the armor with the same intense focus I'd seen him use on ship systems. "Mind if I take a look? I worked on similar biomechanical interfaces back on Kepler Station." Before I could answer, he was already pulling tools from his ever-present kit. I should have stopped him. Should have reminded him about chain of command and proper procedures. Should have made it clear that a human didn't just walk up to a draconis war breed and start tinkering with her equipment. Instead, I found myself holding perfectly still as his hands moved over my armor, his fingers tracing connection points and sensor nodes with surprising familiarity. He was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could hear his breathing as he concentrated. "There's your problem," he murmured, reaching around to access a panel near my shoulder blade. "The impact knocked your neural interface out of sync with the servo responses. Just need to reset the calibration matrix and—" I felt the armor systems coming back online, the weight distribution evening, out the enhanced mobility returning. In 5 minutes, he'd fixed what would have taken the ship's tech hours to diagnose. But more than that, he'd fixed it without making me feel like a burden, without the careful distance that everyone else maintained. He'd just seen a problem and solved it like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Better?" he asked, stepping back to admire his work. I tested the armor's responsiveness, running through a quick series of movements. Everything was perfect. Better than perfect, actually. The calibration was more precise than it had been when the armor was new. "How did you—" I started to ask, then stopped. I wasn't supposed to show curiosity. Weapons didn't ask questions about maintenance procedures. But Eli must have seen something in my expression because he smiled that easy smile of his. "Biomechanical integration isn't that different from ship systems. You just have to listen to what the components are trying to tell you. Your armor was basically screaming that it couldn't talk to your nervous system properly." He started packing up his tools, but I found myself not wanting him to leave. The armory suddenly felt less cold with him in it. "You didn't have authorization to work on my equipment," I said, though there was no heat in my voice. "Nope," he agreed cheerfully. "Probably going to get chewed out by someone for it too. But your armor was broken, and I knew how to fix it. Seemed like the right thing to do." The right thing to do. Such a simple concept, but it hit me like a plasma round to the chest. In my world, people did things because they were ordered to, or because they were afraid not to, or because they expected something in return. But Eli had helped me simply because he could. Why? I asked, the word slipping out before I could stop it. He paused in his packing and looked at me with those impossibly green eyes. "Why what? Why help me? You gain nothing from it. I'm not your commanding officer. You don't owe me anything." For a moment, he looked genuinely confused by the question. Then his expression softened into something I'd never seen before. Something that took me an embarrassingly long time to recognize as compassion. "Kelra," he said, and I realized it was the first time anyone had used my name instead of my rank in years. "You don't need a reason to help someone. That's just what you do. What we should all do." He finished packing his tools and headed for the door, but stopped just before leaving. "Besides," he added with a grin, "I like fixing things that are important, and something tells me you're a lot more important than you realize." Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the armory with a perfectly calibrated armor system and a chest full of emotions I didn't have names for. I sat there for a long time after he left, trying to process what had just happened. This human, this supposedly inferior being, had just treated me with more kindness and respect than I'd received from my own species in decades. He'd looked at me and seen someone worth helping, not because of what I could do for him, but simply because I was there and I needed help. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. And it was the moment I started to realize that maybe, just maybe, being perfect wasn't the same thing as being whole. After the armor incident, something shifted between us. Not dramatically, nothing that would show up on security sensors or in official reports. Just small changes that somehow felt monumental. It started with coffee. The Meridian's galley served standard-issue nutritional paste that was perfectly calibrated for each species' dietary needs. Efficient, complete, and utterly flavorless. I'd never questioned it before. Food was fuel, nothing more. But the morning after Eli fixed my armor, I found him in the galley at 600 hours, standing over a small portable device I'd never seen before. The smell hit me first. Rich, warm, complex, in a way that made something in my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't name. He looked up as I entered, his face lighting up with that smile that was becoming dangerously familiar. "Morning, Kelra," he said, like we were old friends instead of barely acquainted colleagues. "Want some real coffee? I should have said no. Should have grabbed my nutritional paste and returned to my quarters like I did every other morning. Instead, I found myself asking, real coffee? Yeah, the good stuff, not that synthetic garbage they serve in the mess. He gestured to his device, which was apparently brewing something that smelled like heaven. Brought my own beans from home, earth-grown shade roasted on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. My grandmother's recipe. He poured the dark liquid into 2 cups, the steam rising between us like incense. When he handed me the cup, our fingers brushed for just a second. Such a brief contact that it shouldn't have registered, but somehow my enhanced nervous system cataloged every detail. The warmth of his skin, the roughness of his calluses, the way his pulse quickened just slightly when we touched. Try it, he said, and there was something almost shy in his voice. I took a sip, and I swear my entire worldview shifted. This wasn't just fuel for the body. This was pleasure, pure, simple pleasure, with no tactical purpose, no strategic value. Just something that tasted good for the sake of tasting good. It's, I started to say, then stopped. I didn't have words for what it was. Good, he asked hopefully. It's unnecessary, I said instead, but I took another sip, even as I said it. Eli laughed, and the sound did something strange to my internal temperature regulation. The best things usually are. The next morning, I told myself I was just maintaining my patrol schedule when I happened to pass by the galley at 600. Pure coincidence that Eli was there again with his coffee maker. But when he offered me another cup with that easy smile, I didn't refuse. It became a routine. Every morning at 600, I would find myself in the galley, and Eli would be there with 2 cups of coffee. We didn't talk much at first. I wasn't used to casual conversation, and he seemed to understand that. We'd just stand there in comfortable silence, drinking our coffee and watching the stars wheel past the viewports. But gradually words started to creep in. Small observations about the ship, comments about the day's work schedule, questions about Earth coffee cultivation that I had no business caring about, but somehow did. Eli had a way of talking that made everything sound interesting. He could spend 10 minutes explaining the differences between Arabica and Robusta beans with the same passion that most people reserve for matters of life and death. And somewhere in those quiet morning conversations, something unprecedented happened. I smiled. Not the predatory grin I used to intimidate enemies or the formal expression I wore during military ceremonies. A real smile. Spontaneous and genuine and completely unconscious. Eli had been telling me about his childhood on a farming colony, about helping his grandfather repair ancient irrigation systems with nothing but spare parts and determination. Something about the way he described the stubborn old man's refusal to give up reminded me of, well, of him. The smile just happened. One moment I was listening with my usual stoic expression, and the next I felt my lips curve upward of their own accord. It was such a small thing, barely visible to most observers. But Eli noticed immediately. There it is, he said softly, his own smile widening in response. There's what? I asked suddenly, self-conscious. Your smile. I was starting to think you didn't have one. I touched my face reflexively, as if I could feel the expression lingering there. I don't usually. I know, he said gently. That's what makes it special. Special. Another word that had never been applied to me in any context that wasn't terrifying. But the way Eli said it, like he'd just witnessed something precious and rare, made that strange warmth in my chest flare even brighter. It was during one of these morning coffee sessions that Irelna found us. Lieutenant Irelna Voss was the ship's assistant engineer, a Zentari female, who'd served under my command for 3 years before transferring to the Meridian. She was one of the few beings in the galaxy who'd worked closely enough with me to have seen behind the armor, so to speak. Not that there was much to see back then. She entered the galley just as I was actually laughing at one of Eli's stories about a particularly stubborn water recycler that had developed what he swore was a sense of humor. The sound of my laughter seemed to freeze her in place. Commander, she said carefully, her large dark eyes flicking between Eli and me, I didn't expect to find you here. Lieutenant, I replied, my expression snapping back to its usual neutrality. Is there something you need? But Irelna's attention had shifted to Eli, and I didn't like the calculation I saw in her gaze. Centauri were natural analysts capable of processing social dynamics with the same precision they applied to technical problems. And right now she was analyzing the hell out of the situation. "Mr. Vorn, isn't it?" she said pleasantly. "I've heard excellent things about your work." "Just Eli," he replied with his usual friendliness. "And thanks. Irelna Wright, your plasma conduit modifications are brilliant. I've never seen efficiency ratings that high." She preened slightly at the compliment, but her eyes never left his face. "Perhaps we could discuss some collaborative projects. I'd be very interested in your perspective on biomechanical integration." There was something in her tone that set my teeth on edge, though I couldn't quite identify what. Eli, oblivious to the undercurrents, just nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. I'd love to pick your brain about some of the modifications I've been thinking about for the environmental systems." They made arrangements to meet later that day, and Relna left with what I was beginning to recognize as a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with engineering. I felt an odd tightness in my chest as I watched her go. "She seems nice," Eli said, refilling our coffee cups. "She's efficient," I replied, which was true but somehow felt inadequate. That afternoon, I found myself taking an unusual route through the ship that happened to pass by the secondary engineering lab where Eli and Irelna were working. I told myself I was conducting a routine security inspection. The fact that I lingered outside the lab door listening to their conversation was purely incidental. They were deep in technical discussion when I arrived, their voices carrying clearly through the partially open door. Eli was explaining his approach to preventive maintenance, something about building relationships with the machinery rather than just fixing problems as they arose. "You really think of them as alive," Irelna observed, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Not alive exactly," Eli replied, "but responsive, like they have preferences and moods. Treat them with respect and they'll take care of you." "Is that how you approach all your relationships?" she asked, and something in her tone made my enhanced hearing focus even more intently. "With respect and patience?" There was a pause, and I found myself holding my breath. "I try to," Eli said finally. "Seems to work better than the alternatives. Even with those who might seem dangerous, unpredictable." Another pause, longer this time. I pressed myself closer to the wall, my enhanced senses picking up the subtle changes in their breathing patterns, the shift in electromagnetic fields that indicated elevated emotional states. "Especially then," Eli said quietly. "Sometimes the things that seem most dangerous are just hurt, scared, misunderstood." Eli, Irelna said, and her voice had dropped to something that was almost a whisper. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to really listen to the answer." My entire body tensed. Something in her tone triggered every combat instinct I possessed. "Sure," Eli replied, though he sounded puzzled. "The commander," Irelna said carefully, "Kelra, I've served with her before, and I need you to understand what you're dealing with. She isn't like us. She isn't even like other Draconis. She was bred to be a weapon, Eli, enhanced and modified and trained until everything that made her a person was stripped away." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "She's perfectly efficient, perfectly deadly, and perfectly incapable of genuine emotion. What you think you're seeing, this friendship you think you're building with her, it's not real. She's studying you, learning your patterns, your weaknesses. It's what she was made to do." The silence stretched between them, and I found myself unable to breathe. "She isn't capable of affection, Eli. She was made for war. And if you forget that if you let yourself believe she's something she's not, you're going to get hurt in ways you can't imagine." I waited for Eli's response, my hands clenched into fists. Part of me expected him to thank her for the warning, to promise he'd keep his distance, to treat me with the same fearful respect that everyone else did. Instead, I heard him laugh, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement. "Irelna," he said gently, "I think you might be wrong about that." "Wrong?" Her voice sharpened. "Eli, I've seen her service record. I've watched her in combat. I've seen what she's capable of when she needs to be," Eli interrupted. "But that's not who she is all the time. You should see her in the mornings when she thinks no one's watching. The way she holds her coffee cup like it's something precious. The way she listens when I talk about stupid stuff that doesn't matter. The way she smiled yesterday when I told her about my grandfather. She smiled. Irelna sounded genuinely shocked. A real one. Not that scary grin she uses in briefings. A real honest-to-God smile that lit up her whole face. You can't fake something like that, Irelna. You can't manufacture that kind of genuine response. I pressed my back against the wall, my chest tight with emotions I didn't have names for. Besides, Eli continued, even if you were right, even if she was exactly what you say she is, so what, everyone deserves kindness. Everyone deserves to be treated like they matter, especially the ones who've never had it before. The lab fell silent, and I realized I was holding my breath again. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, Irelna said finally. Probably both, Eli admitted cheerfully. But I'd rather be stupid and kind than smart and cold. I heard movement in the lab and quickly moved away from the door, my mind racing. Eli had defended me, not just dismissed Irelna's warnings, but actively argued against them. He'd seen something in me that even I wasn't sure existed anymore. That night I lay in my quarters, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over. Irelna wasn't wrong about what I'd been made to be. She wasn't wrong about my service record or my capabilities. But somehow, impossibly, Eli had looked past all of that and seen something else. Something worth defending. And for the first time in my genetically perfect existence, I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to me than the weapon my creators had built. Maybe somewhere under all that engineering and enhancement and training, there was still a person worth knowing. A person worth Eli's morning coffee and easy smiles and quiet faith that I was more than the sum of my modifications. The thought terrified me, but it also filled me with something I was slowly learning to recognize as hope. 2 weeks after my conversation with Hope, reality came crashing back with the force of a plasma torpedo. We were conducting a routine survey of the Kepler belt when the attack came. No warning, no demands, just sudden violence erupting from the asteroid field around us. 6 ships unmarked but clearly military grade, dropping their stealth fields and opening fire before our sensors could even identify them. The first salvo took out our primary shield generators. The second crippled our engines. By the third, it was clear this wasn't random piracy. Someone wanted the Meridian disabled, not destroyed, which meant they wanted something on board. All hands to battle stations. Captain Morrison's voice echoed through the ship as emergency lights bathed everything in red. This is not a drill. I was already moving before the announcement finished. My armor sealed around me with a familiar hiss, biomechanical systems coming online and flooding my nervous system with combat enhancers. The world sharpened into crystal clarity, time seeming to slow as my enhanced reflexes kicked into overdrive. This was what I'd been made for. This was where all that genetic perfection finally had purpose. The attackers made their first mistake by trying to board us through the main docking bay. Standard tactics for a disabled ship, but they clearly hadn't done their homework about who was on board. I was waiting for them when their cutting torch breached the hull. What happened next? Well, let's just say it reminded everyone why they called me the scale breaker. The first wave came through the breach expecting minimal resistance from a science vessel. Instead, they found 8 feet of genetically enhanced death machine with 4 years of pent-up combat instincts, finally given free rein. I moved through them like they were standing still, my claws tearing through armor plating like it was paper, my enhanced strength, sending bodies flying across the bay. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't clean. It was pure, brutal efficiency, and some distant part of my mind cataloged every broken bone, every severed artery, every final scream with cold satisfaction. This was what I was good at. This was where I belonged. The second wave lasted longer, but not by much. They'd brought heavier weapons thinking firepower could compensate for tactical stupidity. But enhanced reflexes meant I was always one step ahead of their targeting systems, and reinforced bone density meant their small arms fire barely slowed me down. By the time the third wave arrived, the docking bay looked like a slaughterhouse. Bodies everywhere, the air thick with the metallic smell of blood and the acrid stench of burned flesh. I stood in the center of it all, my armor painted red, my claws dripping, and something that felt very much like my old self smiling behind my helmet's faceplate. The remaining attackers took one look at the carnage and decided discretion was the better part of valor. Their ships disengaged and jumped to hyperspace, leaving us alone among the asteroids with our dead and wounded. I stood there in the aftermath, breathing hard, my combat enhancers slowly fading back to baseline levels. The silence was deafening after the chaos of battle. No more weapons fire, no more screaming, just the steady hum of life support systems and the distant sound of damage control teams working to repair critical systems. That's when I saw him. Eli stood in the doorway to the docking bay, his face white with shock, his eyes wide as they took in the scene of destruction. But he wasn't looking at the bodies or the blood or the damaged bulkheads. He was looking at me. And for the first time since he'd arrived on the ship, I saw fear in his eyes. The combat enhancers were gone now, which meant all the emotions I'd been suppressing during the fight came flooding back at once. Shame, regret, and something that felt very much like panic. This was who I really was. Not the person who shared morning coffee and smiled at stupid stories, but this, a killer, a weapon, a monster. Eli, I started to say, but he was already backing away. The injured need help. He stammered, then turned and fled. I wanted to follow him to explain somehow, but there were protocols to follow. Bodies to remove, reports to file, security measures to implement. By the time I finished with my official duties, Eli was nowhere to be found. I didn't see him for 3 days. Oh, he was still on the ship. I tracked his movements through the duty rosters and sensor logs, but somehow we never crossed paths. He was avoiding me, and he was good at it. The ship wasn't that big, which meant he was putting real effort into staying out of my way. It hurt in ways I hadn't expected. The isolation I'd lived with for years suddenly felt crushing instead of merely uncomfortable. I found myself taking longer routes through the ship, hoping to accidentally encounter him. I lingered in the galley every morning at WIS 600, but the coffee maker sat cold and unused. On the 4th day, I finally tracked him down in Maintenance Bay 7, a cramped compartment in the ship's lower levels, where he was supposedly recalibrating atmospheric processors. The work could have been done remotely, but it gave him an excuse to hide away from the main crew areas. And from me. Eli, I said from the doorway. He looked up from his console, and I saw him tense when he recognized me. Commander, is there something you need? Commander, not Kelra. We were back to formal titles and professional distance. We need to talk, I said, stepping into the compartment. It was barely large enough for both of us, which meant he couldn't easily avoid me. I don't think that's necessary, he replied, turning back to his console. I understand the situation perfectly. Do you? I asked, moving closer. Because I don't think you do. Wham! You're a soldier, he said without looking at me. A very effective one. You did what soldiers do. No explanations necessary. But his hands were shaking as he worked, and I could smell the stress pheromones coming off him in waves. He was trying to convince himself as much as me. Look at me, I said quietly. I'm busy. Eli, look at me. He finally turned, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tight. Not fear exactly. Something worse. Disappointment. What you saw in that docking bay, I began, then stopped. How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you make someone understand that the monster and the person who shared coffee with him every morning were the same being? I saw you, he said simply. The real you. The one Irelna warned me about. No, I said more sharply than I'd intended. You saw part of me. One part. The part that matters, he replied. The part that's always been there underneath everything else. I felt something crack inside my chest. You think that's all I am, a killer? I think you're exactly what you were made to be, he said, and there was such sadness in his voice that it hurt to hear. I just forgot that for a while. He turned back to his console, but I wasn't done. Couldn't be done. Not when everything that had started to matter was slipping away. You're wrong, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. Am I? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Kelra, I watched you tear apart 15 trained soldiers with your bare hands. I saw the look on your face when you did it. That wasn't duty or necessity. That was enjoyment. Was it? I tried to remember, but the combat enhancers made everything from the battlefield distant and clinical. Had I enjoyed it, or had I just been good at it? They were trying to kill everyone on this ship, I said, including you. I know that, and I'm grateful you stopped them. But the way you did it, well, he shook his head. There's a difference between protection and annihilation, Kelra. What I saw was annihilation. I wanted to argue to explain that I'd used exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat, but the words died in my throat because I knew he was right. I could have stopped them without the carnage, could have disabled instead of killed, but I hadn't because somewhere deep down I'd enjoyed being what I was made to be. I'm sorry, I said finally, and the words felt strange in my mouth. When was the last time I'd apologized to anyone for anything? For what? He asked. For doing your job, for being what you are, for letting you think I was something else. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the console controls. When he spoke again, his voice was so soft I almost couldn't hear it. You know what the worst part is? I still think you might be. Might be what? Something else, someone else. He turned to look at me again, and I saw something in his eyes I couldn't quite identify. I keep thinking about the way you hold your coffee cup, the way you listen when I talk about stupid things, the way you smiled that one time. Those things don't matter, I said, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. They're the only things that matter, he replied. Everything else is just programming. We stood there in silence for a moment, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Then I noticed something that made my enhanced vision focus more intently. You're hurt, I said. What? Your left arm. You're favoring it. He glanced down at his arm, then back at me. It's nothing. Got caught in a plasma discharge during the attack. Minor burn. But I could smell the wound now that I was paying attention. The sharp scent of damaged tissue, the subtle chemical signature of untreated injury. My enhanced senses could tell it was worse than he was letting on. Show me, I said. It's fine. Eli, show me. He hesitated, then rolled up his sleeve. The burn covered most of his forearm angry red tissue that should have been treated hours ago. He'd wrapped it in a makeshift bandage, but I could tell it wasn't healing properly. Why haven't you been to medical? I demanded. I was busy. He said, not meeting my eyes. Busy avoiding me, he meant. He'd let himself suffer rather than risk running into me in the medical bay. Without asking permission, I moved to the compartment's first aid kit and pulled out proper medical supplies. Eli started to protest, but I gave him a look that cut off his objections. Sit, I ordered, and something in my tone made him comply. I knelt beside him and carefully removed his makeshift bandage. The wound was worse than I'd thought, deep enough to require dermal regeneration therapy. Left untreated much longer, it could have become seriously infected. This is going to hurt, I warned him, then began cleaning the damaged tissue. He hissed between his teeth, but didn't pull away. I worked as gently as I could, my enhanced dexterity allowing me to clean the wound without causing unnecessary damage. But I could feel him tense. Every time I touched him, could smell the spike in his stress levels. I'm not going to hurt you, I said quietly. I know, he replied, but his body language said otherwise. I continued working in silence, applying healing gel and preparing a proper bandage. But as I worked, I became aware of something that made my hands shake slightly. He was bleeding. Such a simple thing, but it hit me with unexpected force. This fragile, kind, impossible human was injured and bleeding, and it was because of me. Not directly, but because he'd been so busy avoiding me after the battle that he'd neglected his own medical care. You bleed, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. What? I looked up at him, my hands still holding the bandage against his wound. You bleed. You hurt. That means you feel. He stared at me for a moment, confusion clear in his green eyes. Of course I feel. I'm human. But I'm not supposed to, I said, and suddenly the words were pouring out of me like water through a broken dam. I was engineered not to feel. Pain, yes, because pain is useful for survival. But not this. Not what I've been feeling since you arrived. Kelra, I was never allowed to feel, I continued, my voice getting rougher with each word. Emotions were weaknesses to be eliminated. Attachments were liabilities to be avoided. I was supposed to be perfect, and perfect weapons don't have feelings. I finished securing his bandage, but I didn't move away. couldn't move away. But then you came, I said, looking directly into his eyes. You brought me coffee and talked to me like I was a person and fixed my armor without asking for anything in return. You made me smile, Eli. Do you understand what that means? I hadn't smiled in 15 years, and you made it happen without even trying. He was very still, watching my face with an intensity that made my enhanced nervous system flutter. And then today, when you looked at me with fear in your eyes, when you saw what I really am and backed away, it hurt. Not physical pain, but something worse. Something I'd never felt before, but somehow knew was going to destroy me if I lost it. Lost what? He asked quietly. This, I said, gesturing between us. Whatever this is. You. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we weren't saying. Finally, Eli reached out with his uninjured hand and touched my face, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw. You're not what they made you, he said softly. You're what you choose to be. And what if what I choose to be isn't enough? I asked. What if the monster is always going to be stronger than the person? His hand was warm against my skin, and I found myself leaning into the touch without conscious thought. Then we'll deal with it, he said. Together. Together. Such a simple word, but it hit me like a revelation. I'd spent my entire existence alone, isolated by my nature and my purpose. But here was this human, this impossibly brave, impossibly kind human offering to stand with me against my own demons. I'm dangerous, I warned him. I know. I could hurt you without meaning to. I know. People are going to say I'm using you, manipulating you, that I'm not capable of genuine emotion. Let them, he said with a smile that reminded me why I'd fallen for him in the first place. I know what I see when I look at you, Kalara, and what I see is someone worth fighting for. For the first time in my genetically perfect existence, I understood what hope felt like. Real hope, not just tactical optimism or strategic confidence, but genuine faith that maybe I could be more than the sum of my programming. Until you, I whispered and kissed him. It was supposed to be gentle, careful, mindful of the difference in our sizes and strengths. But when his arms came up around me, when he kissed me back with a passion that had nothing to do with fear or duty and everything to do with choice, I finally understood what I'd been missing all these years. I'd been missing myself. For exactly 18 hours, I allowed myself to believe that happiness was possible. 18 hours where Eli and I moved through the ship like we belonged together, where he would catch my eye across the mess hall and smile, where I would find excuses to check on his repair work just to hear his voice, where the crew started to notice the change in me, the way I seemed more human. 18 perfect hours before my past came crashing down on both of us. The communication came through during the night cycle priority alpha encryption from the Draconis High Command. Captain Morrison received it first, his face growing increasingly pale as he read the contents. Within minutes, I was summoned to his ready room along with the senior staff. The hologram that materialized above the conference table was immediately familiar. General Vraktar, the architect of the Warbreed program and my direct superior for most of my military career, 8.5 feet of scarred reptilian perfection with golden eyes that had never shown mercy and never would. Commander Vexthari, his image said, those predatory eyes fixed on me despite the distance between us. It has come to our attention that you have developed an inappropriate attachment to one of the humans aboard your current assignment. I felt ice form in my stomach. Somehow they knew. But how? Sir Captain Morrison interjected. I'm not sure I understand the nature of this communication. Commander Vexithari's personal relationships are not subject to... The commander has no personal relationships, Vraktar cut him off with casual brutality. She is property of the Draconis Republic, genetically engineered for a specific purpose. Emotional attachments compromise that purpose and are therefore forbidden. I could feel the eyes of the senior staff on me, could smell their sudden discomfort. This wasn't how they'd expected the conversation to go. Furthermore, Vraktar continued, intelligence reports suggest that this attachment has progressed to the point of operational compromise. The human in question, one Eli Vorn, represents a security risk that must be eliminated. The words hit me like a physical blow. Sir Mr. Vorn has committed no crimes. His service record is exemplary and is irrelevant, Vraktar finished. The order has been given, Commander. You will eliminate the human within 24 hours, or the entire vessel will be classified as a rogue asset and destroyed. The silence in the ready room was deafening. I could hear the subtle sounds of the ship around us, the hum of life support, the distant vibration of the engines. But it all seemed muted compared to the roaring in my ears. General Hada, Captain Morrison said carefully, with respect, you don't have the authority to. We have defense treaties with 17 different species, Vraktar replied coldly. Treaties that specifically address the handling of rogue bioweapons. Commander Vex Thari is classified as such a weapon. If she refuses to comply with direct orders, those treaties authorize any necessary action to contain the threat. Bioweapon, rogue asset, threat to be contained. All those clinical terms for what I'd been trying so hard to become something more than. 24 hours, Commander, Vraktar repeated. Do not disappoint us again. The hologram flickered out, leaving us in stunned silence. I sat there, my hands clenched so tightly that my claws were leaving marks in the conference table. Around me, the senior staff was processing what they'd just heard. Their security chief wasn't just an allied officer. She was a weapon, property, something that could be ordered to kill and expected to comply without question. Kelra, Captain Morrison said quietly, and I realized it was the first time he'd ever used my first name. What are you going to do? I looked at him, this human captain who treated me with respect and dignity, despite knowing what I was. I don't know, I admitted, but that was a lie. I knew exactly what I was going to do. The question was whether I had the courage to do it. I found Eli in his quarters reading a technical manual on plasma containment systems. He looked up when I entered, his face lighting up with that smile that had become the center of my universe. Hey, he said, closing the manual. How was the senior staff meeting? You look. Eli, I interrupted, and something in my tone made his smile fade. We need to talk. I told him everything. About the communication from General Vraktar, about the ultimatum, about what I was, and what that meant for both of us. I watched his face as I spoke, saw the shock and fear and understanding dawn in his green eyes. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. So, he said finally, they want you to kill me. Yes. And if you don't, they'll destroy the entire ship. Yes. He nodded slowly, processing the information with the same methodical approach he used for engineering problems. How long do we have? 24 hours. That's not very long. He stood up and started pacing the small space of his quarters. Okay, let's think about this logically. What are our options? Our options. Even facing death, he was thinking in terms of partnership. There are no options, I said heavily. Either I follow orders and kill you, or everyone on this ship dies. That's not an option, that's a choice, he corrected. And it's not one I'm willing to make for 300 innocent people. Eli, no, he said firmly. I won't be responsible for that kind of collateral damage. If my death saves everyone else, then that's what happens. The casual way he accepted his own death hit me like a punch to the gut. This was what real courage looked like. Not the engineered fearlessness I'd been given, but the conscious choice to do the right thing despite being terrified. I won't do it, I said quietly. He stopped pacing and looked at me. What? I won't kill you. I can't. Kelra, you have to. If you don't, then they'll destroy the ship, I finished. I know, but I won't be the weapon they want me to be. Not anymore. We stood there looking at each other, both of us understanding what this meant. I was choosing him over my duty, over my programming, over the lives of everyone else on the ship. It should have felt like betrayal, but instead it felt like the first honest choice I'd ever made. That's when Irelna appeared in the doorway. I thought I might find you here, she said, her voice carefully neutral. I spun around, my combat instincts immediately on high alert. How long have you been listening? Long enough, she replied, stepping into the quarters. Long enough to know that you're planning to defy a direct order from high command. Eli moved to stand beside me, and I felt a surge of protectiveness that made my claws extend slightly. Irelna, whatever you think you heard, I heard exactly what I expected to hear, she said, her large dark eyes moving between us. I heard someone choosing love over duty, someone choosing to be a person instead of a weapon. The words hung in the air between us. I waited for the condemnation, the reminder of my obligations, the threat to report my intentions to Captain Morrison. Instead, Irelna smiled. "It's about time," she said softly. "What?" I stared at her in confusion. "Kalra, I've served with you for 3 years. I've watched you follow orders without question, complete missions without hesitation, be the perfect soldier in every possible way. And I've watched it slowly kill everything that made you a person." She moved closer, her expression intense. "When I warned Eli about you, it wasn't because I thought you were dangerous to him specifically. It was because I thought you were dangerous to yourself. You were so determined to be what they made you that you were forgetting what you could choose to become." "I don't understand," Eli said. Irelna turned to him. "The communication from General Vraktar, it didn't come through standard channels. Someone intercepted it and forwarded it to us first." My enhanced hearing picked up the subtle stress indicators in her voice. "You," I realized, "you're the one who reported us." "Yes," she admitted, "but not the way you think." She activated a small data pad and projected a holographic display. It showed communication logs, transmission routes, encryption keys, technical data that would have meant nothing to most people, but I'd been trained in intelligence analysis. "I've been monitoring Draconis military channels for months," she explained, "ever since I noticed the changes in you. I knew they'd eventually try to intervene, so I made sure I'd intercept any orders before they reached official channels." "Why?" I asked. "Because I wanted to give you a choice," she replied. "The real communication from High Command was much simpler. Just an order to terminate your assignment and return to active duty immediately. No mention of Eli specifically, no ultimatum about the ship." I felt the world shift around me. The threat to destroy the Meridian? "My addition," she admitted. "I knew you'd never defy orders for your own sake. But for his, for the crew, that might be enough to make you finally choose yourself." Eli was staring at her with something approaching awe. "You manipulated the entire situation." "I gave her an impossible choice and forced her to make it," Irana corrected, "because sometimes that's the only way to discover who you really are." I should have been angry, should have felt betrayed, manipulated, used. Instead, I felt something that might have been gratitude, because she was right. Given a simple order to leave, I might have obeyed. Faced with an impossible choice, I'd finally learned to choose. "So what now?" Eli asked. "Now," Irelna said, "we deal with the real problem. Because while the threat to the ship was fabricated, the order for Kalra to return to active duty is very real. And if she doesn't comply, they will send someone to collect her." "How long do we have?" I asked. "The real deadline is 48 hours. After that, they'll dispatch a retrieval team." I nodded, my tactical mind already working through possibilities. "A retrieval team I could handle, but they won't send just one." "No," Irelna agreed. "They'll send an entire squadron, multiple war breeds, heavy assault craft, enough firepower to level a small city. Because they can't risk me falling into enemy hands," I realized. "If they can't retrieve me, they'll destroy me." Eli had gone very quiet during this exchange. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but I could smell the fear on him. "So we run," he said simply. "Where?" I asked. "There's nowhere in Draconis space that they won't find us." "Then we go outside Draconis space." "That would make me a defector, a traitor to my own species." "You're already a traitor," he pointed out. "The moment you chose me over your orders, you crossed that line. The only question now is whether you're going to own that choice or let them drag you back." I looked at him, this brave, impossible human who was willing to live as a fugitive for my sake. Then I looked at Irelna, who had risked her own career to give me the chance to choose freedom. "If we do this," I said slowly, "there's no going back. Ever. I'll be hunted for the rest of my life." "We'll be hunted," Eli corrected, "and that's okay. I'd rather live one honest day as a fugitive than a lifetime as a lie." "And I'd rather serve a friend than a government," Irelna added. "If you'll have me." I stared at both of them, these two people who were willing to throw away everything they'd known for the sake of someone who hadn't even been sure she was a person until a few weeks ago. "You realize what you're asking," I said. "You're asking me to betray everything I was raised to believe in." No, Eli said gently. We're asking you to believe in yourself. The choice when it came down to it was surprisingly easy. 6 hours later, I stood before the assembled crew of the ISC Meridian in the main cargo bay. Captain Morrison had called an all-hands meeting, ostensibly for a routine security briefing, but everyone knew something bigger was happening. Word had gotten out about the communication from Draconis High Command, and the crew was on edge. I have an announcement to make, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the large space. Effective immediately, I am resigning my commission with the Draconis Republic and requesting political asylum with the United Earth Alliance. The silence that followed was absolute. 300 beings from a dozen different species, all staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to fear to confusion. Furthermore, I continued, I am formally rejecting my classification as military property and asserting my right to self-determination as a sentient being. Captain Morrison stepped forward. Commander, are you certain about this? The implications are that I'm choosing to be a person instead of a weapon? I finished. Yes, Captain, I'm certain. I looked out over the assembled crew, my enhanced vision picking up the subtle signs of their emotional states. Most were afraid, which was understandable. Some were angry, probably those with relatives in Draconis space who might face repercussions. A few looked proud. And there near the back, Eli was smiling at me with such warmth that it made my chest tight with emotions I was still learning to name. I know this puts everyone at risk, I said. I know it complicates our mission and our relationships with the Draconis Republic. But I also know that I can't continue to be what they made me to be. Not when I've finally learned what I could choose to become. I paused, looking directly at Eli. Some of you will say I'm being controlled, manipulated, that I'm not capable of making this kind of decision. But you're wrong. For the first time in my life, I'm making a choice based on what I want, not what I was programmed to want. And what I want is the right to decide my own fate. The crew was still silent, but I could see understanding beginning to dawn on some faces. To those of you who support this decision, thank you. To those who don't, I understand. But either way, this is who I choose to be. I stepped down from the platform and walked through the crowd toward Eli. The crew parted before me, but it felt different than before. Less like fear, more like respect. When I reached him, he took my hand without hesitation. So, he said quietly, what do we do now? Now, I replied, squeezing his fingers, we figure out how to be free. Behind us, I could hear the crew beginning to talk among themselves, processing what they just witnessed. Some were already making plans to leave at the next port, not wanting to be associated with a rogue warbreed. Others were moving closer, offering quiet words of support. But for the first time in my genetically perfect existence, their opinions didn't matter as much as my own. I had chosen, and that choice, terrifying and impossible and completely irrational as it was, felt like the first real thing I'd ever done. Freedom, it turns out, is a lot more complicated than I'd imagined. The three of us left the Meridian at the next neutral port Kepler station with nothing but the clothes on our backs and a ship's shuttle that Eli had somehow convinced Captain Morrison to let us borrow indefinitely. Looking back, I think the captain was just relieved to have us off his ship before the Draconis retrieval teams arrived. Those first few months were hard, harder than any military campaign I'd ever fought. We had no money, no papers, no legal status in any system. Technically, I was still Draconis property, which made harboring us a criminal offense in most civilized space. We lived in the shuttle, taking odd jobs wherever we could find them, always staying one step ahead of bounty hunters and Republic forces. But we were together, and somehow that made all the difference. Eli's engineering skills kept us fed. There wasn't a station or colony ship in the Outer Rim that didn't need something fixed, and he had a reputation for solving impossible problems with limited resources. Irelna's Zentari connections opened doors that would have stayed closed to a rogue warbreed and her human companion. And my combat training, well, it turned out there were plenty of people willing to pay for protection, no questions asked. We weren't exactly respectable, but we were free. It was during our 6th month as fugitives that everything changed. We'd taken a job escorting a medical supply convoy through pirate-infested space, nothing too dangerous by my standards. But the pirates we encountered weren't your typical raiders. They were slavers, and their cargo holds were full of kidnapped civilians from a dozen different species. I could have handled the situation cleanly, efficiently, with minimal collateral damage. Could have disabled their ships and called in the authorities to deal with the aftermath. But when I saw those terrified faces staring out from behind energy barriers, something inside me snapped. Not the old combat programming, something new, something that burned with righteous fury and refused to accept that some beings could treat others as property. Maybe it was because I knew what it felt like to be owned. I didn't just defeat the slavers. I liberated every single captive, made sure they had safe passage home, and sent a message to every other slaver crew in the sector that this kind of business would no longer be tolerated in our territory. Word spreads fast in the outer rim. Within weeks, we were getting calls from people who needed help, but couldn't go through official channels. Refugees fleeing oppressive governments, families trying to escape arranged marriages or forced military service, entire communities being displaced by corporate mining operations. We couldn't save everyone, but we saved who we could. And somewhere along the way, our little crew of 3 became something larger. A network of ships and safe houses and people who believed that freedom was worth fighting for. We called ourselves the Wanderers Alliance, and we operated in the gray spaces between legitimate government authority and outright criminality. Not heroes exactly, but not villains either. Just people trying to make the galaxy a little bit better for those who had nowhere else to turn. The Earth Diplomatic Corps found us 2 years later. Ambassador Sarah Chen was a small, elegant woman who looked like she could be broken by a strong wind. But she had eyes like steel and a mind that could outmaneuver generals and trade negotiators with equal ease. She arrived at our base on Covenant Station with a proposal that sounded too good to be true. The United Earth Alliance is looking for a new approach to interspecies relations, she explained over coffee in our cramped command center. Traditional diplomacy works fine when everyone plays by the same rules, but there are situations where we need someone who understands multiple perspectives, who can speak to both the civilized and the less civilized. Eli squeezed my hand under the table, and I could feel his excitement through our bond. After 2 years together, we'd developed an almost telepathic connection, able to communicate volumes with just a glance or a touch. "You want me to be a diplomat?" I said, not quite believing it. "I want you to be yourself," Chen corrected. "A former military officer who chose conscience over orders. A refugee who built something meaningful from nothing. Someone who understands what it means to be both powerful and powerless. And someone who proves that interspecies cooperation isn't just possible, it's beautiful." She added, her gaze moving between Eli and me. The offer was everything I'd never dared to dream of. Official recognition, legal status, the chance to help people on a scale larger than anything we'd accomplished as the Wanderers Alliance. But it also meant stepping back into the spotlight, becoming a public figure, a symbol of something larger than myself. "I need to think about it," I said. Chen smiled. "Take all the time you need. But for what it's worth, I think you're exactly what the galaxy needs right now." That night, Eli and I walked the observation deck of Covenant Station, looking out at the starfield beyond. The station was home to refugees and traders and outcasts from 100 different worlds, all of them trying to build new lives, far from whatever they'd fled. "What do you think?" I asked him. "I think you're scared," he said, with that gentle honesty that had always been his gift. "Terrified," I admitted. "What if I'm not good at it? What if I make things worse instead of better?" "Then you'll learn and do better next time," he replied. "That's what makes you human." I looked at him in the starlight, this man who had seen me at my worst and somehow convinced me I could be better. "I'm not human, Eli." "Yes, you are," he said firmly. "Maybe not genetically, but in every way that matters. You choose compassion over convenience. You protect the weak even when it costs you. You believe that people can change, can grow, can become more than what they were made to be." He took my hands in his, and I marveled, as I always did, at how something so small could contain so much strength. "They made you to kill," he continued. "But you made me want to live. Really live, not just exist. You showed me that love isn't just about finding someone who accepts you as you are, but finding someone who inspires you to become everything you could be." I kissed him then, there under the stars, surrounded by the quiet hum of a space station, full of people who had chosen hope over despair. And in that moment, I made my choice. 6 months later, I stood in the Grand Assembly Hall on New Geneva, wearing formal diplomatic robes instead of combat armor, representing the Earth Alliance in the most important peace negotiations of the century. The Draconis Republic, the Zentari Confederation, the Corvan Empire, and a dozen smaller powers all gathered to hammer out a new framework for interspecies cooperation. It should have been terrifying. I was facing down some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, including several who still considered me stolen property. But I wasn't alone. Eli sat in the observers section, giving me that encouraging smile that had become my anchor in uncertain times. Irelna was part of the technical support team, making sure all the translation protocols ran smoothly. And scattered throughout the hall were friends and allies from the Wanderers Alliance people whose lives had been changed by our work and who wanted to see that change spread to the rest of the galaxy. The negotiations were brutal. 3 weeks of 12-hour days navigating centuries of mistrust and conflicting interests. There were moments when it looked like the whole thing would collapse into accusations and threats. Times when my old combat instincts screamed at me to solve problems with violence instead of words. But I'd learned patience from Eli, strategic thinking from Irelna, and compassion from the refugees we'd helped over the years. Slowly, painfully, we began to build something that looked like progress. The breakthrough came when I was mediating a dispute between the Draconis military delegation and a group of former Warbreed soldiers who had also defected. The Draconis representatives were insisting that their genetic property be returned to them, while the defectors were demanding recognition as free beings. I stood up slowly, my enhanced height making me tower over everyone else in the room. I think, I said quietly, that this entire discussion is based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The room fell silent. You keep talking about property and ownership and genetic rights, I continued, but you're missing the most important factor in this equation. Choice. I looked directly at General Vraktor, who had been leading the Draconis delegation with his usual cold efficiency. General, you created me to be the perfect weapon. Enhanced strength, accelerated reflexes, absolute obedience to orders. And for 15 years, I was exactly what you wanted me to be. But you made one critical error in your design. And what was that? He asked, his golden eyes narrowing. You made me smart enough to learn, I replied. Smart enough to question, smart enough to realize that perfection and happiness are not the same thing. I gestured to the defectors sitting across the table. Every being in this room, whether they were born free or made to serve, has the fundamental right to determine their own fate. You can't own consciousness, General. You can't copyright free will. And you certainly can't patent the desire to be loved. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then one by one, the defectors began to stand. Not in defiance, but in dignity, claiming their space, their right to exist as more than the sum of their programming. We're not asking for your permission, I said to the Draconis delegation. We're informing you of our decision. We choose to be free. We choose to be more than what we were made to be. And if that makes us traitors to our genetic heritage, then so be it. General Vraktar stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger or disappointment, but something that might have been respect. Very well, he said finally. The Draconis Republic hereby recognizes the right of enhanced beings to self-determination, provided they assume full responsibility for their actions as free agents. It wasn't everything we'd hoped for, but it was a beginning. The final accord was signed 3 days later. Not a perfect document by any means, but one that established basic rights for all sentient beings, regardless of their origin or genetic modifications. A framework for cooperation that acknowledged the complexity of interspecies relationships without trying to force everyone into the same mold. As I affixed my signature to the agreement, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not the end of a mission, but the end of a journey. From weapon to refugee to diplomat to myself, whatever that meant. The reception afterward was a mix of celebration and careful political positioning. Dignitaries and journalists and representatives from a dozen governments all trying to assess what this new agreement would mean for their interests. I made the required speeches, shook the necessary hands, and smiled for the cameras. But the whole time I was aware of Eli moving through the crowd, staying close enough to offer support if I needed it, but far enough away to let me handle things on my own terms. Finally, as the evening wound down and the crowds began to thin, I found myself standing on a balcony overlooking the gardens of the diplomatic compound. The air was warm and sweet, filled with the scent of flowers from a dozen different worlds, and the sound of fountains provided a peaceful counterpoint to the distant hum of the city. Eli joined me, sliding his arms around my waist from behind. I leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "So," he said quietly, "how does it feel to be officially diplomatic?" I considered the question. "Strange," I admitted. "Good strange, but strange." "Any regrets?" I turned in his arms so I could look at him properly. His hair was starting to show gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we first met. But his smile was the same, warm and honest and filled with the kind of love that had taught me what it meant to be human. "Only one," I said. "What's that?" "That it took me so long to figure out who I wanted to be." He laughed, the sound rich and warm in the evening air. "I don't know about that. I think you figured it out exactly when you were supposed to." Inside the reception hall, I could see the last few guests making their farewells, diplomats and officials heading back to their hotels or their ships carrying news of the day's agreements to every corner of the galaxy. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, the slow process of turning words on paper into actual change. But for tonight, I was content to stand here with the man I loved, looking out at a garden full of impossible beauty, feeling for the first time in my life like I truly belonged somewhere. "They made me to kill," I said softly, echoing words I'd spoken to him years before. "But you made me want to live." "No," he corrected gently, his hand finding mine. "You made yourself want to live. I just happened to be there when you figured it out." I squeezed his fingers, marveling as always at the contrast between his human fragility and the strength of spirit that had first drawn me to him. Around us, the night air hummed with the sounds of a living city full of beings from across the galaxy who had chosen to build something together rather than tear each other apart. And for the first time since I'd been grown in a laboratory tank 28 years ago, I smiled, not because I was ordered to, not because I was expected to, but because I was genuinely, completely happy. Not the smile of a weapon trying to appear human, but the smile of a person who had finally learned what it meant to be free. If Kelra's journey from weapon to human touched your heart, hit that subscribe button for more incredible HFY stories where humanity's greatest strength isn't our weapons, but our capacity to love, forgive, and choose who we want to become. What story should we explore next? Let us know in the comments below.